What happens when the woman who owns the airline is told she doesn't belong in her own first-class seat? On an overnight flight bound for Hawthorne International, Dr. Selena Ward, billionaire CEO, civil rights advocate, and a leader known for her quiet strength, expected nothing more than a smooth journey home. Instead, she was confronted with the kind of prejudice she's fought her entire life to dismantle. A flight attendant's hand, a sharp slap, and an insult that echoed in the stunned silence of the cabin. Why would someone risk everything in front of a plane full of witnesses? What did they think she would do? And how far would Selena go to make sure no passenger ever faced this kind of humiliation again? Tonight's story isn't just about one slap. It's about power, dignity, and the moment one woman chose to turn injustice into action that shook an entire industry. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss these powerful, true-to-life stories that challenge what we accept and inspire change where it's needed most. The cabin hummed with a quiet that only the wealthy could afford. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers, champagne rested in crystal flutes, untouched for the moment. Rows of cream leather seats gleamed under a warm, golden glow. Every detail inside Orion Vista Air's flagship jet was curated for comfort and exclusivity, but as Selena Ward knew too well, exclusivity didn't always mean equality. She sat in seat 1A, her posture straight, hands folded loosely in her lap. A charcoal blazer framed her tall, graceful build. No flashy logos, no diamond brooches, no designer sunglasses dangling from a chain. Just simple elegance, the kind that spoke quietly instead of shouting. Her dark curls were pinned in a smooth, understated twist. To anyone passing by, she could have been a professor, a diplomat, or simply a well-dressed traveler. Few would have guessed the truth. A shadow fell across her. "Ma'am," a voice said, bright but edged, "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." Selena looked up slowly. Marla Keaton stood over her, hands clasped in front of her apron, smile tight enough to crack, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is my seat," Selena replied softly. Marla tilted her head, eyes flicking over Selena's face and down to her blazer. "I think there's been a mix-up. This section is reserved for owners and senior officials." "No mix-up," Selena said. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't look away either. Marla gave a dry little laugh, the kind that suggested she knew better. "I've been with Orion Vista for 18 years. I know who belongs here." Something about the way she said it, not just the words, but the weight behind them made a man in 1C glance over, brow furrowed. A woman clutching a designer tote whispered to her husband, but no one intervened. "I'll be happy to get you situated in economy," Marla added. Selena simply repeated, "This is my seat." Marla's smile thinned. "Last chance, ma'am. We have standards on this flight." Selena's expression didn't change. "I understand. Perhaps check the manifest." "I don't need to," Marla said. "I can tell." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass, sharp and loud in their implication. Selena let the silence stretch. Finally, she asked, "May I have a glass of water? Please, we're serving champagne right now." Marla replied, "Water's available in economy." The refusal wasn't just service protocol, it was deliberate. Marla turned on her heel, walking away with a click of polished shoes against the cabin floor. Selena exhaled slowly, not from frustration, but to steady the air in her chest. She had boarded quietly, without an entourage. Years of avoiding public attention had taught her that silence was safer, but today, it seemed, silence wasn't a shield, it was bait. From 2 rows back, Victor Langford, hair silver and neatly combed, watched the exchange without moving a muscle. In another life, decades ago, he had read signals on the faces of diplomats and defectors. The look in Selena's eyes was one he recognized. In the galley, Marla leaned toward another flight attendant, her voice a sharp whisper. "She's sitting in the owner's section." Can you believe that Ethan Cole, young but sharp-eyed, checked the passenger list on his tablet? His stomach tightened. He knew the name. He also knew better than to say it aloud with Marla standing there. Back at 1A, the hum of the engines filled the space Marla had left. Selena smoothed a hand over her jacket. A drop of condensation from a passing glass had landed on the fabric, cold against the warm cabin air. She reached for a napkin from her side table, and then it happened. Marla returned, holding a champagne flute. She leaned over as if to offer it, but her elbow jostled the tray. Champagne splashed over Selena's lap, cold and sticky. Selena reached for a napkin, but Marla's hand shot out, slapping hers away. "Careful," Marla said, as if Selena were the one who had spilled it. The sound wasn't loud, but in the hush of first class, it might as well have been a gunshot. Heads turned. A man, halfway through a sip of his drink, froze, glass hovering midair. Ethan's eyes went wide. Selena sat back, the sting still fresh on her hand. She didn't lash out. She didn't even frown. She just looked at Marla and said, with a voice like still water, "This is my seat." Marla opened her mouth, but whatever word she'd planned stayed trapped behind her teeth. She spun away, disappearing into the galley again. Selena turned her gaze to the window. Outside, the world was a blur of blue and white, clouds rolling beneath the wing. She lifted her phone from the armrest compartment, tapped 3 times on the screen, and slid it back. The message silent. Encrypted was already gone. Victor Langford noticed the movement. He had seen it before, years ago, in other places, under other names. His lips pressed together in something between concern and anticipation. 2 rows behind him, Noah Pierce shifted in his seat. A flash of black plastic had slipped from Selena's jacket when she'd adjusted her lapel a USB drive. Small and unmarked. It had fallen into the narrow shadow between the seats. Noah bent down, pretending to tie his shoelace, and palmed it in one smooth motion. Selena didn't turn, but she knew. She rested her hands on her lap again, the calm never leaving her face. Inside, though, the calculation had already begun. No one else in the cabin knew it yet, but the slap was only the first domino. The chain reaction had just been set in motion. The jet's engines roared a little louder as it climbed into thinner air. Somewhere far ahead, an invisible clock had started counting down, and Selena Ward was ready for what came next. The champagne incident still clung to the air like a faint electric charge. People pretended to go back to their drinks, their tablets, their quiet conversations, but eyes kept drifting toward seat 1A. Even those who had not seen the slap had sensed something shift. It was in the way the young attendant, Ethan Cole, stood a little straighter whenever Marla passed, in the way Victor Langford hadn't turned a page in his magazine for the last 10 minutes. Selena Ward sat as if nothing had happened. Her breathing was even, her gaze steady on the clouds. She had learned, long ago, that the best way to unsettle those who sought to provoke was to give them nothing to work with. But, behind her eyes, thoughts moved quickly. The drive was gone. She had felt the absence the instant it left her jacket. She knew exactly who had taken it, and exactly how much trouble that young man in row 4 had just invited into his life. Noah Pierce sat with his elbows on the armrests, thumbs tracing the smooth surface of the small USB drive in his pocket. He wasn't a thief by habit, but curiosity had always been his undoing. This wasn't some cheap promo stick from a tech conference. Its weight was just slightly wrong, its edges too clean. He imagined all the ways it could be valuable. The rational part of his mind told him to hand it back before anyone noticed. The bolder voice in him whispered about secrets, leverage, and the rush of knowing something others didn't. In the galley. Marla leaned against the counter, recounting her version of events to a colleague from business class. She described Selena's tone as defiant, her manner as entitled. She never mentioned the slap, and she certainly didn't mention the champagne had been her fault. Ethan kept his head down, organizing cutlery, but every word made his hands tighten around the silver. "I know the type," Marla said, "always pushing into spaces they don't belong, thinking rules don't apply to them." Ethan's jaw set. He glanced down at the manifest on his tablet. The name was right there, in bold, Dr. Selena Ward. He had seen it during pre-flight checks, along with the internal tag that marked her as an executive-level passenger. If Marla had looked for more than 2 seconds, she would have seen it too. Maybe she had, and didn't care. Back in the cabin, Victor Langford shifted his legs, leaned slightly into the aisle, and caught Selena's eye. The glance was enough. When the attendant passed by with a tray of nuts, Victor dropped a folded napkin onto Selena's tray. No one else noticed. She picked it up without looking down until her fingers were under the fold. 3 small dots in blue ink stared back at her. Recognition sparked in her chest. 3 dots meant acknowledgement. It meant someone else knew the signal she had sent. Selena allowed herself the smallest nod in the victor's direction. That was all it took. He returned to reading his untouched magazine, as though nothing had passed between them. Noah pulled his laptop from under the seat, opened it, and plugged the USB into a compact hub. The screen blinked. A plain folder icon appeared, but when he clicked it, a password prompt filled the center of the display. No branding, no helpful hints. The interface was stark, military in its simplicity. He tried a few common bypass tricks. The cursor flashed once, then the whole screen went black for a heartbeat before the password box returned. What Noah didn't know was that somewhere, miles above the Earth's surface, an encrypted ping had just been sent from his laptop's signal to an unlisted satellite. Someone was now aware that the drive had been accessed. Someone who wasn't in the cabin. Someone who would not like it. Selena adjusted her seat, eyes flicking toward the cockpit door just as Captain Adrian Voss emerged for a brief walk through the aisle. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her for a fraction longer than on any other passenger. He carried a small tablet in one hand, its display just visible enough for her to notice the glow of a secure communication screen. In the front row of business class, Senator Grace Holloway scrolled through briefing notes on her device, but her attention kept drifting toward the commotion she had observed earlier. She was not easily distracted, and she rarely involved herself in in-flight disputes, but she had seen the deliberate way the champagne had been spilled, the sharpness in Marla's voice, the cool composure of the woman in 1A. It had the smell of something bigger than a service disagreement. In the galley again. Ethan passed Marla, who was now on her third retelling of the story, this time with a little more drama. "I'll give her one more chance," Marla said. "If she doesn't move, I'm calling the captain." Ethan set down the tray he was holding. "You might want to read the manifest again," he said quietly. Marla's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to. I know what I saw." "That's exactly the problem," Ethan replied, then turned away before she could answer. Back in his seat. Noah's laptop screen flickered. A progress bar appeared, labeled Signal Relay Active. He frowned. He hadn't triggered that. The cursor moved on its own for a second, then froze. A chill crept up his spine. He quickly yanked the USB out and shoved it into his pocket, glancing around to see if anyone had been watching. No one seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to react. Selena did not turn toward him, but she caught the motion in the reflection of the window. She could almost feel the nervous energy radiating from his seat. That was the thing about cabins like this. The air carried not just the scent of cedar and citrus, but the undercurrents of human tension. Victor cleared his throat softly, the sound more of a signal than a necessity. Selena glanced toward him again, and this time his eyes flicked toward the rear of the cabin, where Noah sat. The message was clear. They both knew. Marla reappeared at Selena's side, a clipboard in hand, her smile painted back on. "Ma'am," she said, voice sugar-coated, "I'll be needing to confirm your ticket again with corporate." Selena's gaze lifted to meet hers. "No need, but do what you must." Passengers nearby lowered their eyes to their laps, pretending to read, to sleep, to care about anything but the unfolding scene. The hum of the engines was suddenly loud enough to feel. Noah's heart thumped. He had no idea what was on the drive, but his gut told him it wasn't just company memos or a personal photo album, and he had just placed himself in the middle of it, in row 2B. Senator Holloway closed her briefing notes and slid her device into her bag. She had decided to find out who the woman in 1A was, and why the lead flight attendant seemed so determined to push her out of the seat. Marla's shoes clicked away down the aisle. Selena turned her head slightly, looking out the window again, but her mind was elsewhere. The signal had been sent. The old ally in 3A had confirmed receipt. And now there was a rogue element, a passenger with something too dangerous for his own hands. The air in the cabin was still, but it felt like the moment before a storm broke. Outside, the sky was a perfect pale blue. Inside, the smallest movements carried the weight of warning. Victor folded his magazine. Ethan tightened his grip on the tray in his hands. Noah tapped his foot without realizing it. Grace Holloway leaned forward just slightly in her seat. Somewhere, a timer was ticking down. Selena knew the exact moment it had started, and she knew what had to happen before it reached zero. Captain Adrian Voss sat in the cockpit, fingers drumming lightly against the throttle lever. The autopilot was steady, the route smooth, but his focus wasn't on the instruments. A discreet chime had sounded on the secure tablet mounted beside his seat. He tapped it open, eyes narrowing at the header that appeared in stark red text. Directive: do not engage passenger 1A. Maintain current position until further instructions from Office 72. He hadn't heard that code in years. Not since his brief years flying covert government transport missions. Office 72 meant a situation far beyond the airline's purview. It meant intelligence agencies, classified files, and layers of authority that bypassed corporate protocol entirely. His co-pilot glanced over. "Everything all right?" Captain Adrian closed the screen and said simply, "Routine message." He kept his voice level, but his mind was already turning over possibilities. Whoever 1A was, she had the attention of people who usually operated in the shadows. In the cabin, the atmosphere had settled into a quiet hum, but it was the brittle quiet of a room where no one trusted what might happen next. Selena Ward sat with the same composed stillness she had maintained since boarding, her hands loosely clasped, her gaze on the thin streaks of clouds drifting past. Her calm wasn't an act. It was a practiced shield, honed over years of courtrooms, negotiations, and, more recently, the kind of boardroom battles that never made the news but decided the fate of companies. Noah Pierce, in row 4, had stuffed the USB deep into his pocket. He hadn't dared plug it in again after the strange flicker on his laptop. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. That flicker hadn't been a glitch. It had been deliberate. Something or someone had seen him. He found himself glancing toward the front of the cabin, toward the woman he'd taken it from. She hadn't turned around, hadn't confronted him, but he felt the weight of her awareness. 2 rows ahead, Victor Langford adjusted his reading glasses and leaned back, giving the appearance of a man simply passing the time. In reality, he was watching everyone. Years in intelligence had trained him to see patterns in the smallest gestures, the nervous tap of Noah's foot, the way Marla avoided looking directly at Selena, the subtle set of Ethan Cole's shoulders every time he passed 1A. Senator Grace Holloway, in 2B, had stopped pretending to read her notes. She had noticed the shift in dynamics, the looks, the hesitations, the careful avoidance. Something in her political instincts told her this wasn't just a personality clash between a demanding passenger and a stubborn crew member. There was a current under the surface. Ethan emerged from the galley, pushing a cart slowly up the aisle. He stopped briefly at 1A. "Anything I can get for you, Doctor?" Ward, his voice was calm, neutral to any eavesdropper. But the deliberate use of her title was not lost on Selena. A small acknowledgement. She met his eyes for a second and said, "Water, please." He nodded and poured it without hesitation. From the galley, Marla watched the interaction, lips pressed in a thin line. She wasn't used to being bypassed, especially not in first-class service. She made a mental note to speak to Ethan later. The cockpit door opened briefly as Adrian stepped into the aisle. He walked through first class under the guise of stretching his legs, but his real purpose was to assess the cabin. His gaze slid over the passengers, landing momentarily on Selena. There was no flicker of recognition in his face, but the pause in his step was noticeable to anyone paying attention. He continued toward the rear of the cabin, giving a subtle nod to Grace Holloway as he passed. Grace raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. Noah took the moment to lean slightly into the aisle and catch Ethan's attention as he passed. "Hey, is everything normal? Feels like the crew's on edge." Ethan gave him a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's fine, sir." Then he moved on, leaving Noah more uneasy than before. In the galley, Marla busied herself with checking the service inventory, though she kept glancing toward the cockpit. She was debating whether to escalate her complaint about 1A directly to the captain. In her mind, passengers who challenged her authority didn't belong in first class, no matter what their ticket said. Victor folded his magazine at last and rose, moving toward the restroom. As he passed Selena's seat, he murmured, barely audible, "Drive's compromised." He didn't slow down, didn't break stride, but Selena's eyes shifted ever so slightly to follow him. She took a slow breath. If the drive was already touched, time was shorter than she'd hoped. In row 2B. Grace Holloway turned her head just enough to take in the sight of Marla stiffly rearranging the cart for no real reason. She decided it was time to get answers. Grace leaned toward the aisle and caught Ethan as he returned. "Could you tell me the name of the passenger in 1A?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm allowed to share. I'm a sitting senator," she interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "You can share it." After a brief pause, he said, "Dr. Selena Ward." Grace sat back, recognition dawning. She had heard the name in corporate news, though Selena rarely appeared in public. The CEO of Orion Vista Air, the owner of the jet they were sitting in. Grace's mind began connecting threads. If that was true, then Marla's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was deeply reckless. The secure tablet in Adrian's cockpit chimed again. This time, the message was shorter. Maintain current altitude. Await coordinates. Passenger 1A priority interest. He frowned. Priority interest wasn't airline terminology. It was intelligence language. He closed the screen, his mind tightening around the decision that might soon be forced on him. In the cabin. Selena sipped her water and placed the glass carefully back on the tray. She could feel the shifts in the air the captains walked through. Grace Holloway's attention. Victor's whispered warning. Pieces were moving. The question was whether they were moving toward her or against her. Marla approached again, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am," she began, "I'm still not seeing your name in the correct section." Selena looked up at her calmly. "Perhaps you're not looking closely enough?" Marla's lips tightened. "I know what I'm looking for. That's the problem," Selena replied softly. The words hung between them, quiet but heavy. For a heartbeat, Marla seemed ready to snap back, but she caught herself and stepped away. Grace Holloway had been watching. She leaned back in her seat, her decision made. If this continued, she would intervene. She had spent too many years in public service to watch blatant bias play out in silence. In row 4. Noah shifted again, the USB burning metaphorically in his pocket. He felt as if he was holding a lit match in a room full of dry paper. He had no idea what exactly was on it, but he had seen enough odd reactions to know it was dangerous. The engines droned steadily, but the tension in the cabin was anything but steady. It was tightening, coiling. Somewhere in the sky between departure and destination, the line between an uncomfortable flight and something far more dangerous was beginning to blur. Selena glanced once more toward the cockpit door. The encrypted signal she had sent was out there, received, acknowledged, but she had no illusions. The response could come from friend or foe, and until she knew which, she would remain exactly where she was. The hum of the engines deepened as the jet maintained its course. For now, Captain Adrian Voss read the new message twice before he believed it. The secure tablet's glow cast a pale light over his hands. Divert course immediately. Coordinates attached. Priority interest extraction. Passenger 1A. Office 72 Authority. He glanced at the co-pilot, who was checking instrument readouts. "We're changing course," Adrian said. "Mechanical issue, no." Adrian replied. "Route and change from above. direct from HQ. It was not technically a lie, but the words felt heavy on his tongue. The co-pilot adjusted the controls. A subtle turn began, barely enough for most passengers to feel, but noticeable to anyone who paid attention to flight paths. Outside, the light shifted as the aircraft angled away from its original course. In first class, Senator Grace Holloway noticed. Years of travel had made her sensitive to the slightest changes in a plane's movement. She opened the map on her tablet, watching the blue arc on the screen slowly bend southward. They were no longer heading directly toward their destination. Across the aisle, Victor Langford also noticed. His magazine remained in his lap, but his eyes had sharpened, the way a seasoned hunter's might when the wind changed direction. He looked toward 1A, toward Selena Ward, and saw that she had already registered the shift. She sat perfectly still, but her right hand rested on the armrest in a way that suggested she was bracing for more than turbulence. Marla Keaton, oblivious to the navigation change, returned to her mental script. She approached 1A again, voice tinged with false warmth. "Ma'am, for the comfort of our other guests, I need to insist we move you to the appropriate seat." Selena's gaze lifted. Her tone was calm, almost gentle. "You're about to make a very serious mistake." Marla's smile tightened. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Selena said. "I'm warning you." The exchange drew the attention of passengers nearby. A man in 1C set down his drink. A woman in 2A stopped typing on her laptop. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thicker, the quiet no longer comfortable but expectant. Ethan Cole emerged from the galley, a tray of drinks in hand, and saw the scene unfolding again. He slowed his pace. Marla turned to him as if expecting backup, but Ethan's expression gave her nothing. From the cockpit, Adrian's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been instructed to make a brief, unscheduled landing for a security review. We appreciate your cooperation and will keep you informed." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Security review was vague enough to mean anything, but the idea of landing somewhere unplanned never sat well with passengers. Grace Holloway closed her eyes briefly. She'd been in politics long enough to know what phrases like security review often meant. They meant someone on board had been flagged, and she had a very good guess who that someone was. Selena turned her head toward the window, her reflection looking back at her in the glass. She had expected this possibility. It was one of the reasons she had chosen this particular flight, this particular day. The timing was no accident. Marla looked almost triumphant. "We'll have security meet us when we land," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "I'm sure they'll sort everything out." "Of that," Selena replied, "I have no doubt." The minutes stretched. The captain's announcement did little to settle the restless energy in the cabin. Conversations were shorter, eyes more watchful. The subtle class divide that usually defined first class had shifted into something else entirely, a divide between those who sensed the undercurrent and those still trying to ignore it. Grace leaned toward the aisle. "Captain," she called as Adrian passed through again. "Where exactly are we landing?" "A secure airfield," he said. "I can't disclose more until we're on the ground." "That's not good enough," Grace replied. "You have a U.S. senator asking for basic transparency." Adrian paused, his voice low. "Senator, I'm under strict instructions. This isn't a typical diversion." She studied his face for a moment and saw the tension there, the way his jaw tightened slightly. "Is this about 1A?" she asked quietly. Adrian didn't answer, which was answer enough. He continued toward the galley. Victor Langford rose from his seat and walked toward the front, pausing briefly beside Grace. "If they're doing what I think they're doing," he murmured, "you'll want to be ready when we touch down." She nodded. "And you?" "I'll be ready," Victor said, before moving on to speak quietly with Selena. "Extraction?" he asked under his breath. Selena's eyes met his. "That's the word they're using. You want me to intervene?" "Not yet," she said, "but be ready." Marla hovered near the galley, sensing movement but not understanding the undercurrents. She had interpreted the captain's diversion as validation of her suspicions. In her mind, the passenger in 1A was about to be removed, and she would be credited for noticing the problem before anyone else. In row 4, Noah Pierce glanced at the moving map on his seatback screen. The aircraft's path had clearly shifted. His stomach tightened. He didn't know if the change had anything to do with the device in his pocket, but he suspected it did. He decided then that whatever was on that USB wasn't worth the kind of trouble that diverted planes. The descent began subtly, a gradual dip that made drinks tremble in their glasses. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Outside the window, the horizon tilted as the plane banked toward a stretch of open desert. There was no glitter of city lights, no dense pattern of streets, just a barren expanse beneath the fading sun. The cabin grew quieter still. Passengers looked out the windows, whispering questions to each other. The idea of a security review had transformed into something less abstract, more unnerving. Grace Holloway sat back in her seat, one hand resting on her phone. She was already composing messages in her head, deciding who she would contact the moment she had a signal. Selena closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, but to focus. She could feel the shift in the air, the invisible alignment of forces that always preceded confrontation. She had been here before, not on a plane, but in situations where the walls seemed to close in and the exits were controlled by someone else. Ethan Cole moved quietly through the cabin, checking seat belts, offering reassurance in a voice that felt more genuine than the announcements. When he reached 1A, he knelt slightly and spoke just above a whisper. "We're going somewhere in Nevada, not a commercial field." Selena opened her eyes. "Thank you." Marla appeared moments later, her professional smile back in place. "Please remain seated as we prepare to land," she said to the cabin, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure 1A heard every word. Selena looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the window. "Enjoy this moment," she said quietly. "It won't last." The landing was smooth but carried none of the usual routine. There was no welcome from the tower, no sight of a terminal, only the faint outline of hangars and the distant figures of vehicles waiting on the tarmac. As the plane taxied to a stop, passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Victor Langford stood, stretching slightly, his eyes on the movement outside. Grace Holloway unclipped her belt, ignoring the illuminated sign. Noah stayed seated, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. When the door opened, the heat of the desert rolled in. Figures in dark tactical uniforms began to climb the mobile stairs toward the cabin. Marla's smile returned. She stepped forward to greet them, gesturing toward 1A. Selena stood slowly, smoothing her blazer, her expression unchanged. "You have no idea," she said to Marla, "who you just put your hands on." And then the first officer stepped into the cabin, scanning for her, as the rest of the passengers held their breath. The desert air hit like a wall when the cabin door swung open. It was thick with heat and dry enough to draw the moisture from a person's throat in seconds. The smell was different out here, too. It was not the recycled air of an airport, but the faint tang of dust and fuel. 3 men in dark, tactical uniforms climbed the stairs toward the plane, boots striking the metal steps in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Their faces were hidden behind tinted goggles, their movements efficient but without haste. These were not airline security staff. Marla Keaton stood at the front, posture straight, smile fixed. She gestured toward the first row as if presenting a problem she had neatly solved. Passenger in 1A, she told them, she needs to be removed for questioning. Selena Ward remained seated. She was angled slightly toward the window, her gaze distant, as though the entire scene was unfolding somewhere far away. Her stillness seemed to unsettle the nearest passengers more than the armed men boarding. Victor Langford, standing 2 rows back, crossed his arms. He had seen extractions before. This one was unusual. There was no rush, no raised voices. It was almost as if the men believed they had all the time in the world. Grace Holloway rose from her seat without waiting for permission. "I am a United States Senator," she announced, her voice clear and steady. "Before you put a hand on her, you will tell me exactly which agency you represent and on what authority you are here." The lead officer didn't even turn his head. His voice came through a modulator in his mask, flat and impersonal. "This does not concern you. Senator, sit down." That, Grace replied, was the wrong thing to say. Noah Pierce's hand tightened around the armrest. The USB drive in his pocket felt heavier with every passing second. He had been telling himself all along that it was none of his business, but watching heavily armed men ignore a senator was a different matter entirely. Ethan Cole stepped forward from the galley, placing himself just to the side of Marla. "Captain Voss," he called toward the cockpit. "You might want to be out here for this." Adrian emerged seconds later, his face unreadable. "What's the situation?" The lead officer handed him a small black folder. Adrian opened it, scanned the single page inside, then closed it again. "You're here for passenger 1A, he said quietly. Selena stood then. Slowly, deliberately. She smoothed the front of her blazer and stepped into the aisle. The heat coming through the open door touched her face, but her voice remained cool. "You came all this way," she said to the men, "and you didn't even introduce yourselves." The second officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, you will come with us. Now." Grace moved to block him. "You will not take her without telling us where and why. This is still United States airspace, and you will answer to the Senate Judiciary Committee if you overstep." For the first time, the lead officer turned to face her fully. "Senator, you do not have clearance to be briefed on this operation. Stand aside." Victor Langford's voice cut in from behind. It was not loud, but it carried. "You're making a procedural error. The moment you stepped onto this aircraft, you entered a private property owned by Orion Vista Air. You cannot remove its CEO without her consent unless you can produce a valid warrant. Do you have one?" The officer hesitated. The question was legal, but the weight in Victor's tone came from somewhere deeper, the kind of authority that could make people disappear from the other side of the table. Marla looked between them, her confidence beginning to crack. "She doesn't belong here," she blurted. She's been causing problems since boarding." Selena turned her gaze on her at last. "What I have been," she said softly, "is patient." Ethan's eyes flicked between the officers, the captain, and Selena. He sensed the moment was balanced on a knife's edge. Adrian cleared his throat. "If this is a federal matter, I need to log the reason for the passenger's removal in my flight report. Which department should I note?" The lead officer ignored him and took another step toward Selena. The cabin was so silent that the hum of the APU and the faint clink of glassware could be heard. Selena did not move back. "Before you touch me," she said, "look at the corner of your screen." The officer's head tilted slightly. His wrist device flickered. Whatever he saw made his hand still. Victor took a slow step closer. "You just realized you're not the only ones watching." Grace crossed her arms. "And now, gentlemen, you'll explain yourselves, or you'll leave." The lead officer exchanged a glance with the others. The tension in the air shifted, like a rope pulled taut and then slackened by a fraction. From the tarmac, a black SUV rolled to a stop beside the mobile stairs. The driver's door opened, and a man in a plain suit stepped out. His tie was loose, his hair wind-blown, but his presence was enough to make the tactical officers pause. He climbed the stairs without hurry. "Dr. Ward," he said as he reached the top, "you have a remarkable way of keeping people busy." Selena regarded him evenly. "And you have a remarkable way of arriving late." "Traffic," he said with the faintest smile. Then, turning to the officers, "Stand down. She's not going anywhere with you." The lead officer stiffened. "Our orders have been superseded," the man interrupted. He flashed a badge too quickly for anyone but Selena and Victor to read. "She's under my protection now." Adrian stepped back, relieved not to have to choose a side openly. Grace's posture softened, but only slightly. She was still ready for the fight if the man in the suit turned out to be another layer of the same problem. Noah let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Marla, on the other hand, looked confused, almost betrayed. This wasn't how she had pictured her victory. Selena stepped into the open doorway, the desert wind pulling at the edges of her jacket. She looked at the hangar in the distance, at the vehicles parked like silent watchers. "We're not done here," she said quietly, to no one and to everyone. The man in the suit gestured toward the stairs. "We'll talk inside," he said. She didn't move yet. Instead, she turned back into the cabin. Her eyes met Ethan's first. "Thank you," then Grace's. "I'll need you soon," and finally Victor's. "Stay close." Only then did she step down onto the tarmac, the man in the suit falling into step beside her. The tactical officers moved aside, their presence still heavy in the air, inside the cabin. Passengers began to murmur again, voices rising now that the moment of frozen silence had passed. Noah shifted in his seat, his mind racing. Whatever was happening was bigger than he had thought, and he was sitting in the middle of it. Marla stood near the galley, still holding her clipboard like a shield. She had the uneasy sense that something had slipped beyond her control. On the tarmac, Selena reached the SUV. Before getting in, she looked back at the plane, her gaze lingering on the open door. She wasn't leaving for good. Not yet. She slid into the back seat. The man in the suit closed the door behind her. The SUV's engine rumbled to life, and with a slow, deliberate turn, it rolled toward the far end of the airfield, leaving heat ripples in its wake. Above them, The sun sank lower, casting long shadows over the plain, and the people left to wonder what would happen next. The cabin had begun to settle after the SUV rolled away, but the atmosphere remained thick with curiosity and unease. Passengers exchanged theories in hushed tones. Some thought Selena Ward had been taken into custody. Others believed she was part of something covert and untouchable. No one knew for sure. Marla Keaton busied herself with unnecessary tasks, refolding blankets, aligning silverware, her movement sharp and quick. It was as if tidying objects could also tidy the memory of what had just happened. But the memory refused to fade. Ethan Cole poured himself a small glass of water in the galley. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. Something about Selena's composure still lingered in him. She hadn't looked scared. If anything, she had looked like someone who knew exactly what was coming next. Captain Adrian Voss stood in the cockpit doorway, speaking quietly to the co-pilot. They had received new instructions from the tower, but the orders felt strange. Hold position, do not refuel, await further clearance. It was an unusual directive, especially with no visible maintenance crew on the tarmac. Out beyond the windows, the desert heat shimmered above the asphalt. The hangar doors at the far end of the airfield were closed now. The black SUV nowhere in sight. Then, just as the first hints of boredom began to creep into the passengers' faces, movement appeared on the tarmac. Another SUV approached. This one was larger, armored, and painted in an unmarked matte gray. Its tires whispered against the asphalt as it rolled to a stop at the base of the mobile stairs. The rear door opened. Selena Ward stepped out. She had removed her blazer. The desert wind teased at the sleeves of her crisp white shirt. Her walk was unhurried, each step measured. The man in the suit from earlier followed a few paces behind, but his role was clearly different now. He looked less like a handler and more like an escort. Marla froze mid-step in the galley, eyes locked on the open door. Her throat tightened. She had been so certain Selena was gone for good. Ethan set his glass down. A faint smile touched his lips, though he kept it to himself. Selena climbed the stairs without touching the rail. She paused at the top, letting her gaze sweep across the first-class cabin. Conversation stilled instantly. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder in the silence. "Captain," she said evenly, "I'll be resuming my seat." Adrian straightened, his tone respectful. "Of course, Dr. Ward." She walked past him, past the rows of wide-eyed passengers until she reached 1A. She set her bag down gently, as though nothing had happened at all. Then she turned to face the cabin. "I owe you all some clarity," she began. Her voice was calm, each word carrying to the far end of the cabin without effort. What just occurred was a misunderstanding between agencies. That misunderstanding has been resolved. A passenger in 2B raised a hand slightly. "Are we in danger?" Selena's eyes softened. "Only from boredom if we don't get moving again." The comment drew a ripple of laughter, thin but real, and the tension shifted. Grace Holloway, who had remained seated the whole time, gave the faintest nod. She could see it now. Selena was taking control of the narrative. Victor Langford's gaze never left Selena's face. He recognized the subtle cues, the way she positioned herself so the light from the window framed her just enough to draw the eye. This was deliberate. Marla took a step forward, lips parting as if to speak, but Selena's glance cut her off. It was not harsh. It was worse. It was dismissive. "Mr. Cole," Selena said, looking toward Ethan. "Please see that everyone in this cabin is comfortable. Drinks, food, whatever they need." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied, moving to comply. Adrian cleared his throat. "We're still waiting for clearance to resume, but I'll let the tower know you've returned." Selena inclined her head. "Do that." As the captain returned to the cockpit, Selena took her seat again. Her fingers tapped once against the armrest, a small rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of the engines still idling below. Outside, the gray SUV remained parked at the foot of the stairs, its presence a silent message that whatever authority Selena commanded, it was not just symbolic. Grace leaned toward her across the aisle. "You planned this." Selena's smile was faint. "I anticipated it, and now," Grace asked. "Now," Selena said, "we wait for the right moment." Noah Pierce sat 2 rows back, pretending to scroll through his phone. Though his mind was far from any screen, he had seen her leave with armed men, he had seen her return under her own power, and he had no idea what to make of it. Marla retreated toward the galley, but her mind was far from the tasks at hand. Something in the balance of power had shifted, and she could feel it. The passenger she had tried to have removed was not just back, she was in control. Ethan moved through the aisle with renewed energy, serving drinks and checking on passengers. When he reached 1A again, he leaned in slightly. "You're not just a CEO. Are you?" Selena's eyes met his, not on paper. He nodded once, understanding more than she had said. Minutes passed. The hum of the cabin settled into something closer to normal. Conversations returned, though quieter than before. The mobile stairs were pulled away, the SUV rolling slowly back toward the hangars. Adrian's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared to continue our flight. Please remain seated as we prepare for takeoff." The engines surged to life, a deep vibration running through the floor. The plane began to taxi, turning toward the long stretch of runway. Selena leaned back in her seat, eyes on the horizon beyond the window. The sun was dipping lower, painting the desert in deep golds and shadows. She knew the next phase would not wait until landing. The cabin was still a controlled environment, and in a controlled environment, she could set the terms. Grace watched her, recognizing the quiet gathering of momentum. She had seen it in political chambers, in courtrooms, in moments before decisive votes. It was the stillness before a wave broke. Victor closed his eyes briefly, as though committing this exact moment to memory. The wheels left the runway, the ground falling away beneath them. The desert light faded, replaced by the soft glow of the cabin's evening lighting. Selena opened her eyes and looked toward Marla, who was avoiding her gaze. "Ms. Keaton," she said, her voice carrying clearly after takeoff. "Please join me for a conversation." Marla's head snapped up. "Of course," she managed, though her voice was tight. Selena's expression remained neutral. "Good. I believe in giving people the opportunity to explain themselves." It was not a threat, but it was not far from one either. As the aircraft climbed into the darkening sky, the balance of power had shifted entirely. Selena was no longer a passenger under scrutiny. She was the center of gravity, and everyone in the cabin from the captain to the last row of first class could feel it. She closed her eyes again, letting the hum of the engines wash over her. The time for patience was almost over. The time for action was coming fast. The seatbelt sign clicked off with a faint chime. The aircraft had leveled, the engines settling into a steady hum. Outside, night had claimed the sky, and the stars stretched endlessly beyond the cabin windows. Selena Ward remained in her seat for a moment after the chime, her gaze fixed on the faint reflection of her own face in the glass. The calm in her posture concealed a pulse of measured intention. Across the aisle, Grace Holloway sipped from a glass of water, watching. She had learned long ago that Selena was not one to rush. Every word, every move was calculated for impact. Marla Keaton moved quickly down the aisle, her professional smile pinned in place. She pretended to check on passengers, but her eyes darted to Selena's row with unease. She had heard the request no, the instruction to speak after takeoff, and she could feel every passing second pulling her closer to that moment. When Selena finally spoke, it was not loud, but it was clear enough to reach the galley. "Ms. Keaton." Marla's steps faltered. She turned, her heels clicking softly on the carpet, and walked toward 1A. She stopped just short of Selena's seat, clasping her hands in front of her. "Yes." "Dr. Ward." Selena looked up at her with an expression that gave nothing away. "Please, sit." The request was not a suggestion. Marla hesitated, glancing toward the other passengers, aware that sitting would strip her of the distance and authority she usually carried. But something in Selena's gaze left her without a choice. She lowered herself into the empty seat in 1B. Selena's voice was calm. "Earlier today, you attempted to have me removed from this flight. You told armed officers that I did not belong here." Why Marla straightened. "You were disruptive, questioning my instructions. It's my responsibility to maintain order in the cabin." Selena tilted her head slightly. "Disruptive. Is that the word you would use for a passenger who asks why they are being moved from a seat they paid for?" "It's not just about the seat," Marla replied, her voice sharper now. "There are protocols. You were making other passengers uncomfortable." Selena's eyes narrowed, but her tone remained even. "Which passengers?" Marla's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced toward the rows behind them, but no one met her gaze. Grace set down her glass with deliberate care. "I certainly wasn't uncomfortable," she said. "In fact, I was concerned by how quickly you escalated the situation." Marla flushed. "Senator, with all respect, I was doing my job." "Your job," Selena said, leaning slightly forward, "is to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers, not just the ones you approve of." Ethan Cole, moving through the aisle with a tray of drinks, slowed as he passed. He didn't interrupt, but his presence lingered like an unspoken testimony. Marla's hands tightened in her lap. "I didn't mean any disrespect." Selena's voice softened, but the edge was still there. "You didn't have to mean it. You acted on it, and those actions have consequences." Marla shifted in her seat. The hum of the engines filled the pause. Selena continued. "You made a decision based on your judgment of who belongs in first class. You were wrong. The danger isn't that you misjudged me. It's that you might do the same to someone without the means to challenge you." A murmur ran through the nearby rows. Passengers leaned slightly toward the exchange, drawn by the quiet weight in Selena's words. Victor Langford, 2 rows back, spoke without raising his voice. "Perception can be more dangerous than intent. People build careers on one, destroy them on the other." Marla's shoulders stiffened. "Are you saying I should be fired?" Selena's gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying you should understand the power you hold when you wear that uniform, and the harm you can cause when you misuse it. For a moment, The two women sat in silence, the air between them taut as a drawn bow. Finally, Selena leaned back. "You may return to your duties, but understand this, Ms. Keaton, this conversation is not over. It will continue in a setting where every word is recorded and every action reviewed." Marla rose slowly, her eyes flicking between Selena and Grace, then to Victor, then finally to Ethan. She walked back toward the galley, her steps measured but lacking the crisp confidence from before. Selena watched her go, then turned her attention to the passengers. "I thank you for your patience earlier," she said. "I know today has been unusual. We will arrive safely, and in the meantime, I encourage you to enjoy the rest of the flight." Her tone was gracious, but beneath it was a current of command that no one mistook for casual politeness. Grace leaned slightly toward her. That was merciful. Selena's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Mercy is a choice. I like to see if people understand it before I decide how much to extend. Ethan stopped by her row as he passed again. "She won't forget that conversation." "She's not supposed to," Selena replied. As the hours stretched ahead of them, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. The tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed into a kind of quiet vigilance. Passengers glanced toward 1A more often than before, not in suspicion, but in a strange mix of curiosity and respect. Victor reclined his seat, watching the interplay of shadows across the cabin walls. "You've tilted the balance," he said quietly to Selena. "It needed tilting." She replied, and somewhere in the galley, Marla stood alone, her hands gripping the counter as if to steady herself. The hum of the aircraft seemed louder back there, the metal and plastic surfaces amplifying every faint vibration. She told herself she was still in control, but the echo of Selena's words made her wonder. Back in 1A. Selena closed her eyes briefly, letting the low thrum of the engines settle into her bones. The confrontation was only a step, not the conclusion. She could already see the next move forming, the one that would make this flight unforgettable for reasons Marla had yet to grasp. Grace caught her glance and gave a faint smile. "You're not finished." "No," Selena said softly. "Not yet." The night outside was deep and endless, but inside the cabin, the game was still very much alive, and Selena Ward was holding the board. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft pushed into the upper atmosphere. A soft chime preceded Captain Adrian Voss's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received word from the operations center. Due to a developing weather system ahead, we may experience periods of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." The passengers exchanged murmurs. Some tightened their belts. Others barely looked up from their screens. Turbulence was a normal part of flying. Selena Ward glanced at Grace Holloway. The senator's eyes narrowed slightly, catching the same thing Selena had. There had been no mention of weather in the pre-flight briefing, and Adrian's tone had been measured. Too measured, like a man choosing each word for reasons beyond meteorology. The hum of the engines deepened as the nose tilted upward. Outside, the stars blurred against a darker horizon. A slight tremor passed through the floor, barely enough to rattle the glassware, but enough for a few passengers to grip their armrests. In the galley. Marla Keaton braced herself against the counter. She was still replaying her conversation with Selena. The rhythm of her breathing was shallow, uneven. She hated that Selena's voice kept echoing in her head. Ethan Cole noticed her pale expression. Rough air makes some people nervous, he said quietly. "I'm not nervous." Marla replied too quickly. Ethan didn't press. He had learned that truth revealed itself when silence had room to work. Another tremor rippled through the cabin, stronger this time. The overhead bins gave a faint creak. A passenger's champagne flute tipped, spilling a golden arc across the tray table. Selena sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. The motion of the plane was nothing compared to the shift she felt in the undercurrent of the flight. This was not just weather. She knew enough about corporate operations to recognize when a signal was being sent. Victor Langford, 2 rows behind, leaned toward Noah Pierce. "You feel it, too. Don't you?" Noah kept his eyes forward. "It's not the plane I'm worried about." Minutes later, Adrian's voice returned, softer now. "Dr. Ward, please join me in the cockpit." The cabin fell into an instant hush. It was not common for a captain to summon a passenger to the cockpit, especially mid-flight. Eyes followed Selena as she rose. She adjusted her cuffs and moved down the aisle, the motion of the plane causing her to sway slightly, though her balance never faltered. Grace Holloway watched her go, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. Inside the cockpit, the light was dim, the panels glowing with a constellation of buttons and displays. Adrian gestured for her to sit in the jump seat. "We've been contacted by the board," he said quietly, glancing toward the co-pilot, who was carefully pretending not to listen. "There's a directive to divert to Ridgefield Air Base. Official reason is the weather, but I'm guessing you know the real reason." Selena's expression remained unreadable. "They want to contain me." Adrian hesitated. "You're aware the owner of this airline is—" "I'm aware." Selena interrupted. "And you're aware I'm not just a passenger." He nodded once. "What do you want me to do?" Selena looked at the radar display. The weather system was real enough, but it was not blocking their direct route. The diversion was manufactured. "Maintain course for now," she said, "but prepare for a cabin-wide announcement in 15 minutes. I'll give you the words." Adrian exhaled slowly. "Understood." Selena rose and left the cockpit without another word. As she walked back through the aisle, she could feel the shift in the passengers' focus. They were leaning in now, hungry for answers. She stopped at her seat, turned to face the cabin, and let the hum of the engines fill the space before she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed we may be diverted. You deserve to know that this decision is not due to weather alone. It is a decision driven by individuals who believe silence is the safest course when mistakes are made in public." Murmurs swept through the rows. A man in 2C frowned. "Are you saying someone's trying to remove you from this flight again?" Selena's voice remained steady. "I am saying that accountability makes some people uncomfortable, and when those people have influence, they will use it to avoid being seen." Grace spoke up, her tone crisp. "As a sitting senator, I can confirm that what Dr. Ward is telling you is serious. I will personally document what happens from here." Victor's voice joined in from behind. "And so will I." Ethan paused in the aisle, his tray of glasses forgotten. He could feel the current of resolve building in the cabin. Passengers were no longer just witnesses. They were becoming participants. Another shudder ran through the plane, the turbulence making the lights flicker for the briefest moment. It was enough to remind everyone how quickly control could slip away. Selena held the gaze of the man in 2C, then looked slowly across the cabin. "I don't expect you to take sides. I expect you to watch, to remember what you see here, to tell it as it happened. Noah Pierce leaned forward in his seat, speaking for the first time. And what exactly is going to happen? Selena's lips curved into the faintest smile. The truth. And people with power do not always like how it looks in the light. She sat down again, the murmurs swelling behind her. Grace turned slightly in her seat, catching the glance of 3 passengers who gave small, almost imperceptible nods. In the galley, Marla watched the scene unfold from a narrow gap in the curtain. She felt the shift in the air and didn't like it. This was no longer a dispute she could control with polite dismissal. This was becoming public, and public meant recorded, replayed, dissected. 10 minutes later, Adrian's voice returned over the intercom. We will be maintaining our current course to Hawthorne International. Weather ahead remains stable enough for safe passage. Thank you for your patience. There was a ripple of quiet applause from the cabin, not loud, but enough to send a message. Selena closed her eyes briefly, letting the small victory settle without drawing too much attention to herself. This was not the end game, but it was the first time in hours that she had shifted the board entirely in her favor. She opened her eyes again and caught Ethan's glance. He gave a slight nod as he passed. The kind of nod that meant I saw what you did. Outside. The stars hung steady against the black expanse, but inside the cabin, something far more volatile was in motion. Selena could feel it. The next move would not be hers alone. It would belong to everyone who had just chosen to watch. The cabin had taken on a different atmosphere. It was not just the dimmed lighting or the smooth hum of the engines. It was the awareness that something larger than the flight itself was in motion. Passengers were glancing at one another with the subtle acknowledgement of shared involvement, as if they were all in on the same unspoken agreement. Selena Ward sat in 1A, perfectly still, her hands loosely clasped in her lap. Her composure was not a mask now, it was a signal. Every move she made from here would be deliberate. Grace Holloway leaned toward her. They're rattled. You've got their attention. But attention fades unless you do something with it. Selena's gaze shifted briefly toward the galley curtain. I will, but not yet. Noah Pierce had been quiet for most of the flight. Now, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device no larger than a credit card. It lit up faintly in his hand. I can boost the cabin Wi-Fi bandwidth. It will make live streaming smoother. If this is going public, it needs to be clear and uninterrupted. Selena glanced at him, one brow lifting slightly. You think ahead. I know a viral moment when I see one. Noah replied. Victor Langford, still seated 2 rows back, spoke without looking up from the book in his hands. A viral moment without context is noise. A viral moment with structure is testimony. Selena absorbed that. Then we give them structure. She stood, her movements measured, and stepped into the aisle. The soft lighting followed her like a stage spotlight. Conversations hushed almost instantly. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice calm yet carrying easily through the cabin. You have all witnessed parts of what has happened on this flight. You saw me approached, challenged, and nearly removed from my seat without cause. You saw attempts to isolate me from my rightful place. And you heard a diversion order that has now been reversed. There was a low murmur of agreement, the sound of people confirming to themselves what they had seen. I am not asking you to take my side, Selena continued. I'm asking you to remember what you have seen and heard. Remember it in detail. Remember it if you are asked later. And if anyone tries to tell you that what happened was different from what you saw, remember how it felt to be here in this cabin tonight. Grace, seated nearby, angled her phone discreetly, recording. Ethan Cole, further down the aisle, had stopped moving entirely, watching and listening. A man in 3D raised his hand slightly. Why would anyone try to change the story Selena's eyes met his? Because the truth can be inconvenient to those who hold power. And because the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Noah shifted slightly, his device still glowing faintly in his hand. Grace caught his eye and gave the barest nod. Within seconds, several passengers began holding up their phones, discreetly or openly recording. Marla Keaton emerged from the galley, her expression tight. "Dr. Ward, I must ask you to remain seated. You are disrupting the cabin." Selena turned her head slowly toward her, her tone still soft. "Ms. Keaton, I'm speaking to my fellow passengers. They are not uncomfortable. Are you—" The question landed with more weight than its volume suggested. Marla's jaw tightened. This is not how we handle issues on board. "And yet, here we are," Selena said. Grace spoke up without looking at Marla. "I suggest you tread carefully. Ms. Keaton, there are at least a dozen cameras pointed in your direction right now, mine included." The murmur in the cabin grew louder. Passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning into the aisle for a better view. This was no longer a private disagreement. This was a collective witnessing. Marla's eyes darted toward the cockpit, but Adrian Voss did not emerge. Selena let the moment hang for just long enough. Then she addressed the passengers again. "I want you to know why this matters. Not because of who I am, but because of what it means for the person who cannot speak up, for the person who gets quietly removed without anyone noticing, for the person who spends the rest of their life wondering if they should have said something but didn't." A woman in 2B spoke softly but firmly. "I've seen it happen. Not here, but in other places. People being singled out. It stays with you." Selena nodded. "It stays with all of us, and the only way it changes is when those who see it refuse to let it pass quietly." Ethan moved closer, speaking just loudly enough for the rows nearby to hear. "The manifest says she's exactly where she belongs. There was never a mistake." Marla shot him a sharp look, but he didn't flinch. Selena looked over the passengers once more. "When we land, some of you will be approached. There may be questions, requests for statements, even suggestions about what you should say. I'm asking you to tell the truth exactly as you saw it. Nothing more. Nothing less." The agreement was silent, but it was there in the subtle nods, in the set of people's shoulders, in the way they held their phones a little steadier. Selena returned to her seat. Grace leaned toward her. "You've made the cabin your courtroom." "Not yet," Selena said quietly. "Right now, it's the jury box." Outside, the sky was an uninterrupted stretch of darkness, the stars cold and distant. Inside, the temperature felt different, charged, expectant. Marla retreated to the galley again, the curtain swaying slightly as it closed. She gripped the counter with both hands, her breathing uneven. She had not lost. Not yet. But the control she had relied on for 18 years felt like sand slipping through her fingers. In 1A, Selena closed her eyes briefly. Not in rest, but in calculation. She knew the next move would determine everything, not just how this flight ended, but what would follow on the ground. Noah leaned slightly into the aisle, catching her attention without speaking. He tapped the small device in his hand once, and she understood. The feed was already live. Selena's lips curved in the faintest, most deliberate smile. The sky outside might have been silent, but inside the cabin, her voice was about to travel far beyond these walls, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing would ever be the same after that. The soft glow from passenger screens lit the cabin in shifting shades of blue and white. Somewhere toward the rear, a baby gave a short cry before settling again. The engines hummed steadily, a low, constant note beneath everything, in 1A. Selena Ward leaned slightly toward Noah Pierce. He tilted his phone so she could see the streaming interface. The feed was active. Numbers ticked upward in the corner, the count of live viewers growing by the second. Grace Holloway, seated just across the aisle, was already on a secure line with her chief of staff. "Yes, keep monitoring," she murmured into her headset. "Record everything coming through social channels. No, don't engage yet. Just collect." Victor Langford glanced over the top of his book. "If you're going to speak, now's the time. Attention is like altitude. You can lose it before you realize it's gone." Selena took a slow breath and then rose to her feet. The cabin quieted almost instantly, as though some unspoken cue had been given. Her presence was a gravity that drew every eye. "Good evening," she began, looking directly into Noah's camera. Her voice carried clearly, each word measured. "My name is Dr. Selena Ward. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Orion Vista Air. And yes, I'm speaking to you from aboard one of our own flights." A ripple of surprise moved through the passengers. Even those who had suspected she was someone important now had confirmation. Selena continued, her gaze steady on the lens. "Tonight, I was nearly removed from my seat in first class, not because of a safety concern, not because of any wrongdoing, but because a member of this crew decided I did not belong here. Those are her words, not mine." Gasps and low voices stirred through the rows. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, but none looked away. "This is not the first time such a decision has been made against someone who looks like me," Selena said, her tone calm but unyielding. "And it will not be the last unless we decide, together, that it ends here, in the galley." Marla Keaton froze, her hands stilling over a stack of service trays. She could hear every word through the narrow curtain, and she knew it was not just the cabin listening now. Selena's voice deepened slightly, her cadence perfect for the streaming audience. "This is about more than a seat. It is about the quiet, everyday ways that dignity is taken from people, ways that are justified as procedure, or policy, or protocol. I am here to say, in front of witnesses, that this cannot be hidden under the noise of routine." Grace shifted in her seat to catch more of the cabin in her own recording. "This is live," she whispered to Victor. "Every word is going to trend." Victor nodded once, then make sure it trends with context. Selena turned slightly, allowing the camera to catch a glimpse of the passengers around her. "You are seeing this as it happens. You will decide for yourself what you believe. But I ask you if you have ever been told you don't belong somewhere you have every right to be. Remember how it felt. That feeling is why I'm standing here." Noah's phone vibrated in his hand. A silent alert. He glanced at the screen. 50,000 viewers and climbing. Selena kept going. "When this plane lands, there will be statements, there will be press releases, there will be attempts to rewrite the order of events. But the truth is already here, in your hands, in your eyes, and the truth does not belong to those who try to bury it. It belongs to the people who lived it. In the cockpit. Captain Adrian Voss monitored a separate comms channel, his earpiece buzzing with urgent voices from operations control. Get her to stop. One voice insisted. Another barked, kill the feed. Adrian didn't respond. His hands remained on the controls, his expression unreadable. Back in the cabin, Ethan Cole had moved quietly toward the rear, whispering to passengers to check their phones, to watch and share. It wasn't defiance for the sake of rebellion, it was defense against the story being erased. Selena took one last breath before concluding. This is my airline. These are my passengers. And tonight, we're going to land exactly where we set out to go, together, without erasing what happened in the sky between departure and arrival. She stepped back into her seat. The silence that followed was thick, not with discomfort, but with a shared sense of something irreversible. Grace leaned in. You just detonated the story. Selena's eyes remained forward. No, I just gave it wings. Noah's device pinged again. 100,000 viewers. Trending number 3 nationally. In the galley. Marla was breathing fast now, the reality settling in. There was no undoing a live broadcast. Every second of it was in the hands of people she could not control. From the cockpit, Adrian's voice came over the intercom, warm and even. Ladies and gentlemen, we have clear skies ahead. Estimated arrival is on time. Please enjoy the remainder of your flight. It was a simple message, but in the context of the last hour, it carried an unspoken meaning the course would not change. Selena settled back, closing her eyes for a moment. Not in relief there was still more to come, but in acknowledgement that the fight had shifted terrain. What began as a private humiliation was now a matter of public record. Grace checked her feed again. They're already pulling clips, adding captions, sharing with the tag Ward Flight. You won't be able to slow it down now. I'm not going to, Selena replied. Victor's voice drifted forward from behind. Once a story is in the wind, you don't fight it head on. You guide it where it needs to go. Selena opened her eyes, her expression calm but focused. Then that's what we'll do. Somewhere below, the world continued unaware for now, but above the clouds, in a sealed cabin 37,000 feet in the air, a story had begun that would land long before the plane touched the runway. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, charged with a strange mix of calm and anticipation. The live stream was still running on Noah Pierce's device, the viewer count rolling upward like a stock ticker in overdrive. Passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering quietly, others glued to their screens, watching the feed they were part of. Selena Ward sat with her hands resting lightly on her knees, her breathing steady. Outwardly, she appeared serene. Inwardly, she was mapping every possible move that might come before they reached Hawthorne International. She knew the ground team would be scrambling. She knew there were still people willing to bend rules to keep her from stepping off this flight on her own terms. Grace Holloway leaned in. My office just sent me a screenshot. You're the #1 trending topic in the country right now. Not just in aviation news across all platforms. Selena's gaze didn't shift from the aisle ahead. That means they'll try harder before we land. In the galley, Marla Keaton stood stiffly, her phone buzzing with incoming messages from an unknown number. She read the latest one and her stomach tightened. Get her to stop talking. Remove the device. Do it before descent. Marla had worked long enough to know what that kind of instruction meant. No official order, no paper trail, but an expectation that would be remembered later if she failed. Ethan Cole stepped into the galley just then, his presence quiet but deliberate. "You okay?" he asked, his tone carrying more than casual concern. "I'm fine," Marla said, tucking her phone out of sight. Ethan's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he returned to the aisle. He didn't buy it. Selena was already aware of the shift. She had seen Marla glance toward her seat with something sharper than irritation. The hostility was no longer professional pride wounded by challenge. It was something more urgent, more dangerous. Noah checked the signal strength on his device. Still stable, but if she tries to grab it, I can't guarantee it won't cut. Selena considered that. Then we make sure she never gets close enough to try. Victor Langford closed his book and placed it neatly on the tray table. People underestimate the cabin as a controlled environment. Every move here is visible, whether you think it is or not. Marla emerged from the galley, her expression smoothed into polite neutrality. She began moving slowly down the aisle, stopping here and there to check seat belts, adjust blankets, offer water. It was professional, methodical, and yet unmistakably moving in Selena's direction. Grace shifted slightly, her phone angled to capture the approach. Ethan paused mid-service, placing himself subtly between Marla and row 1. Marla smiled faintly. "Excuse me, Dr. Ward. I just need to check." Selena looked up, her expression unchanging. "No, you don't." The words were quiet but final. Marla blinked. It's standard procedure. Selena cut her off. Still calm. "Your procedure does not require taking a passenger's property without cause. You're not taking this device." Several passengers leaned forward now, phones lifted. The moment had witnesses from multiple angles. Grace spoke firmly. "Ms. Keaton, I suggest you return to your station before you create another incident on record." Marla hesitated, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Senator." She stepped back, but the tension didn't leave her posture as she retreated toward the galley. Ethan watched her go, his jaw tight. Noah exhaled quietly. That was close. Selena nodded once. It won't be the last attempt. The rest of the cabin seemed to sense the confrontation had shifted the stakes again. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were now clearly aware that something deliberate was being done to suppress the story. Victor's voice came from behind. "If she's the smart kind of loyal, she'll stop now. If she's the dangerous kind, she'll make one more move before we land." Selena's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm betting on the second." 20 minutes passed, the quiet punctuated only by the soft clink of glassware and the steady hum of the engines. The city lights were still far away below, the darkness outside stretching endless in every direction. Then, without warning, the cabin lights flickered, just once, barely enough to be noticed. Noah's device hiccuped, the signal dipped for a fraction of a second before stabilizing again. He glanced at Selena. That wasn't random. Grace lowered her voice. "They might be testing ways to cut you off." Selena remained composed. "Then we adapt." She reached into her bag and produced a second, smaller device. "This one's offline. It records locally. If they kill the signal, the record stays." Noah's eyes lit with understanding. Smart. Another 15 minutes to descent. Adrian's voice came over the intercom, steady as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial approach into Hawthorne International. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all devices are secured for landing. In the galley. Marla's phone buzzed again. She read the short message, then slipped it into her pocket without response. Her face was calm now, but her hands were too still. Ethan noticed. He moved toward the galley slowly, deliberately. "Almost there," he said. Marla looked at him. Yes, but her eyes were fixed on row 1. Selena could feel it, that subtle tightening in the air, the way a cabin seems to narrow when something's about to happen. She placed the secondary device in her lap, angled so it could capture both her and the aisle. Grace's hand rested lightly on her phone, ready to record from another angle. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane descended. The seatbelt chime sounded, and Marla began walking down the aisle again. Every passenger's eyes followed her this time. Selena didn't move. She simply waited. When Marla reached the front row, she stopped. Her voice was pleasant, but her tone was edged. "Dr. Ward, for safety. I need to secure any loose electronics during landing." Selena's reply was quiet but unwavering. "No. You need to land this plane without interference. You will not touch my property." The air between them felt almost physical now. Victor leaned slightly forward from his seat. "Ms. Keaton, I suggest you think about how this moment will look on every screen in the country by morning." Marla's eyes flickered, just for a moment. She looked from Selena to the passengers holding up their phones, and then, slowly, she stepped back. Without another word, she turned and returned to the galley. Selena kept her gaze on the aisle until the curtain swayed closed. Only then did she glance at Noah. "We're almost there." Grace smiled faintly, and when we land, Selena's expression was calm, almost serene. "When we land, the real work begins." Outside, the city lights were growing brighter, sprawling like a living map beneath the wing. Inside, the cabin was silent, but for the sound of seat belts tightening and devices being readied. Every person here knew they were minutes away from the ground and from whatever waited there. The landing gear thumped into place beneath them, a deep metallic sound that resonated through the floor. The cabin tilted slightly as the jet began its final descent into Hawthorne International. Outside, the sprawl of the city glittered like spilled stars. Selena Ward kept her gaze on the window for a moment longer, letting the pattern of light and shadow settle into her mind. She knew the moment the wheels met the runway, the next chapter of this night would begin. Noah Pierce checked his device. Signals still strong. Viewers are holding steady at 160,000. Grace Holloway tapped her earpiece. "My team is already at the terminal. You're going to have cameras on you the second we disembark." Selena's tone was calm. "Good. Let them see everything." Victor Langford closed his eyes briefly as if centering himself. The trick now is not to let them dictate the first question. Whoever asks the first question sets the frame. Make sure it's someone you trust. The seatbelt chime sounded again. Captain Adrian Voss's voice came over the intercom, steady and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hawthorne International. We'll be on the ground in just a few moments. For your safety, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." The aircraft shuddered gently as it touched down, rubber kissing asphalt in a burst of friction. The engines roared as Adrian reversed thrust, slowing the massive jet down the length of the runway. In the galley, Marla Keaton stood rigid. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't move to check it. The night had turned, and she knew it. Every attempt to control the situation had slipped away in front of hundreds of witnesses, and now hundreds of thousands online. The plane taxied toward the gate. Selena sat motionless, hands still on her knees. Her stillness was not passivity, it was discipline. The kind of discipline that unnerved people who expected reaction and got control instead. The chime sounded. The seatbelt light flicked off. Grace gave her a nod. Time. Selena stood, smoothing her blazer. The cabin erupted in the soft chaos of people retrieving bags, stretching limbs, and checking phones. But no one left their row ahead of her. When she stepped into the aisle, cameras rose. Passengers held their devices high, documenting every move. Marla stepped forward from the galley, her expression stiff. "Dr. Ward." Selena didn't break stride. "You've said enough tonight, Ms. Keaton." The jet bridge was already connected when the forward door opened. On the other side, a cluster of uniformed airport security stood alongside a wall of press photographers, cameras flashing in rapid bursts. Grace moved just behind Selena, her presence both protective and strategic. Noah followed, his phone still streaming. Victor walked a step behind, the old spy's instinct making him scan the crowd for angles others missed. The first voice from the press broke through the noise. "Dr. Ward, is it true you were assaulted by a member of your own flight crew?" Selena paused just long enough to let the silence frame her answer. "It is true that I was struck. It is also true that I will not let this moment be reduced to one incident. What happened tonight is a part of a larger pattern, and that is what we are going to address." Another reporter shouted. "Will there be consequences for the crew?" Selena's eyes found the camera lens. "There will be consequences for a culture that allowed this to happen. Individual accountability is necessary, but structural change is the goal." Grace stepped in smoothly. "We'll have a formal statement in the morning. Tonight, Dr. Ward is speaking directly to the public." The terminal was a blur of movement, passengers disembarking, curious travelers stopping mid-stride, security managing the press. Outside the glass wall, the night was thick with the flash of media vans and live feed setups. Selena walked to a small podium hastily set up near the gate. Someone had clipped a microphone there, its cord trailing to a camera rig. She placed both hands on the podium and looked directly into the lens. "Tonight," she began, "on a flight operated by the company I lead, I experienced something no passenger should ever experience: discrimination dressed as procedure, disrespect presented as protocol. But this is not about my seat in first class. It is about every person who has been told, in ways both loud and quiet, that they do not belong." The terminal noise dimmed. Even those not directly involved turned to listen. "We talk about safety in aviation," Selena continued, her voice carrying. "But safety is not just about engines and weather. Safety is also about trust. The trust that you will be treated with dignity, from the moment you step on board to the moment you leave the aircraft. That trust was broken tonight, and I intend to rebuild it." A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Selena's gaze swept the onlookers. "I will be meeting with our board tomorrow morning. We will not wait for this to fade. We will implement a new standard for crew training, for passenger rights, for accountability, and yes, this will apply to me as much as anyone else." From the side, Noah caught a glimpse of Marla being escorted quietly by two uniformed supervisors. She kept her chin high, but her eyes darted toward the cameras before she disappeared into a service corridor. Selena finished simply. I thank the passengers who witnessed tonight's events, who had the courage to document and share. And I promise you, this story will not end at this gate. It will end when no one else has to tell it again. Applause broke out, not the polite kind, but the sharp, decisive sound of people agreeing with more than just words. Grace touched her arm. That was it. That's the message that will stick. Victor smiled faintly. And now you've made it impossible for them to bury it. Selena nodded. That was the point. The rest of the walk through the terminal was slower, the weight of media attention pressing in on all sides. But Selena moved with the same quiet authority she had shown from the start. By the time she reached the waiting car outside, the clip of her speech was already circulating online. The caption reading, "This is my airline. This is our standard." She slid into the back seat, closed the door, and exhaled. Not from relief, but from resolve. Noah leaned forward from the front passenger seat. That feed is still climbing. It's going to break 1 million views before sunrise. Selena looked out at the line of lights along the runway. Good. Let it. The more people see it, the harder it will be to forget. Grace adjusted her jacket, her tone measured. Tomorrow is going to be loud. Selena's lips curved slightly. Tomorrow is going to be the beginning. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the night traffic. Behind them, Hawthorne International buzzed with the energy of a story in motion, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of any terminal. And, for the first time since she had boarded that flight, Selena allowed herself to imagine the possibility that the sky itself could change. In the end, Selena didn't just reclaim her seat, she reclaimed the narrative for herself, for the passengers who stood with her, and for the countless others who had been told in subtle or brutal ways. You don't belong here. She reminded us that respect is not a courtesy. It's a right. And when that right is denied, the choice we make in response can echo far beyond a single moment. What happened on that flight will live on not as a story of humiliation, but as a blueprint for justice. It's a reminder that even at 35,000 feet, the fight against discrimination has no altitude limit, and that dignity, once defended, becomes impossible to take away. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it made you feel the weight of what's at stake, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep telling stories that shine a light on injustice and celebrate the courage to confront it. Because the next story might just be the one that changes everything.